In 2004, a 22-year-old striker was being talked about as the best in the world. 2 Copa America awards, a nickname that stuck because nobody could argue with it. L'Imperatore, the emperor. 6 years later, he was untraceable. Missing training, missing entire seasons, living back in the same favela he grew up in, while European clubs were still technically paying his wages. Everyone called it wasted talent. Nobody called it what it actually was. This is the story of Adriano, and the 1 week that explains everything people got wrong about him. Before we get to the fall, you need to actually understand the height, because most people don't. They know the punchline. They don't know what came before it. Adriano grew up in Vila Cruzeiro, a favela on the north side of Rio. Brazilian football had already turned neighborhoods like his into a pipeline. The whole football world was watching by then, so on its own, that part isn't unusual. What made him different showed up the second he stepped onto a real pitch. A left-foot scouts genuinely struggled to describe without sounding like they were exaggerating, and a build that let him do something almost nobody else his size could do: bully grown men off the ball, then finish with a speed that had no business coming out of a frame that big. Inter signed him in 2001. He was still a teenager. The first couple of years went the way it usually goes for young South Americans dropped into a massive European club, loaned out, adjusting, learning the pace. Then 2004 happened. On loan at Parma, he started scoring at a rate that got every scout in Europe looking his direction again. And Inter pulled him back to Milan, this time not as a prospect, as the guy the whole attack ran through. What followed is one of the most dominant stretches a Serie A striker has ever had. For 2, maybe 3 seasons, Adriano wasn't just good. He was the kind of good that made defenders look physically overmatched before the whistle even blew. That's where the nickname came from. Italian press started calling him L'Imperatore because there wasn't really another word for it. Fans built chants around him. Opposing managers built entire game plans specifically to stop him, and still, most of the time, failed. It went well beyond the club too. Brazil had one of the deepest attacking lineups in the sport's history at that point, and Adriano wasn't riding the bench of it. He was a starter, a difference maker, mentioned in the same breath as the actual best strikers alive. At the 2004 Copa America, he finished top scorer and walked away with player of the tournament. Not hype, not a hot take, just fact, sitting there in the record books. People were seriously talking about him as a future Ballon d'Or winner, not as a joke, as a live conversation happening in real time. This is the part everyone skips when they tell his story, because it doesn't fit the wasted talent version people already have in their heads. But it matters, because everything else in this video stands on top of it. At this exact moment, there was no crack yet. Nothing was wrong. There was just a 22-year-old who had already done enough, in public on the stat sheet, to be called one of the best on the planet, with everyone assuming there was more still coming. That's the guy standing at the top in 2004, feared, undisputed, called an emperor by the same press that would, a few years later, reach for a completely different set of words to describe him, which is exactly why what happens next deserves more than a shrug. What does it actually take to build a player that dominant? And what does that same foundation quietly cost him? Later, when something happens that nothing in his training ever prepared him for. Almir dos Santos, Adriano's father, died in July 2004. Heart attack, sudden. Back in Vila Cruzeiro, the same neighborhood his son had come from. No warning, no time to prepare for it. Adriano was 22, sitting at the exact peak we just walked through, fresh off being named the best player at the Copa America, being talked about across Europe as football's next great one, when the news reached him. What happened after isn't a single tragic moment with a tidy aftermath. It's a slow unraveling, documented in real time, that played out over years in front of a football press that watched every stage of it happen and, for a long stretch, had no idea what it was actually looking at. The first crack showed up in his body. Within months, Italian outlets were reporting he was showing up to training overweight, nowhere near the condition that had made him unplayable a season earlier. This wasn't a one-off rumor. It kept coming back, season after season, in Serie A coverage, with Inter's own staff addressing his fitness publicly more than once. A player whose entire game ran on explosive power and finishing speed was, by his own club's admission, no longer training like one. Then came the absences, not from matches, from training itself. Missed sessions turned into enough of a recurring story that it stopped reading as an occasional slip and started reading a pattern the club had to actively manage. Inter tried the things clubs try: private talks, discipline, and eventually loans back to Brazil, starting with Flamengo, framed at the time as giving him space to reset somewhere more comfortable. And then there's the part Adriano has actually said himself, years later, in his own words. He's talked openly about struggling with alcohol during this stretch. Not something journalists pinned on him, something he's confirmed directly, describing drinking as part of how he was coping. He's also talked about depression from this period, again in his own words. Not a label someone else stuck on him from outside, but something he chose to name once enough time had passed for him to look back on it clearly. None of these facts is shocking on its own. Weight fluctuates. Athletes miss sessions. Plenty of athletes drink too much or go through depression. That alone wouldn't make Adriano's story stand out from a dozen others. What makes it different is the timing and how exact it is. A father's sudden death at the precise moment his son is standing at the highest point of his career so far, immediately followed by every single one of these patterns showing up, one after another, in the public record. Clubs know how to manage a hamstring. They've got fitness coaches, tactical staff, medical teams built for exactly that. What almost no club in that era had, and honestly, a lot still don't, was any real system for a 22-year-old losing his father at the exact moment the entire sport is demanding more from him than it's ever demanded from anyone. Inter tried. Loans, conversations, discipline. But none of it actually touched the thing sitting underneath all of it, because none of those tools were ever built to. Which leaves the question that actually matters here, more than any single missed session or reported incident. Was this just one person's private collapse? Something that would have happened no matter who was watching? Or was it a warning sign an entire sport watched unfold in slow motion for years and did nothing about, because the guy at the center of it was worth too much on the pitch for anyone to stop and actually ask what was happening to him off it? By the time Adriano's career reached its final years, the football world had already settled on its word for what happened to him. Waste, wasted talent, wasted potential, the emperor who threw it all away. It's the simplest possible way to tell it. It's also, once you actually look at what he did next, probably wrong. Here's what's on record. Through the late 2000s and into the 2010s, bouncing through Flamengo again, briefly Sao Paulo, a stint at Corinthians, each stop shorter and quieter than the last, Adriano kept doing something Italian and Brazilian outlets both reported on repeatedly. First like it was a scandal, and only much later, in a few corners, like it was something worth actually trying to understand. He kept going back to Vila Cruzeiro, not visiting, not some staged appearance with a camera crew trailing him. Actually living there for real stretches of time, in the same neighborhood he grew up in, while he was still under contract to clubs paying him to be somewhere else entirely. Reports from that period describe him skipping training to be there, going unreachable for stretches, choosing the same streets that raised him over the facilities and cities that had made him rich. Every incentive in professional football assumes players want to move one direction: up. More money, more visibility, further from wherever they started. What Adriano actually did run straight against that, over and over, for years, too consistent to write off as one rough patch. He had more resources than almost anyone from that neighborhood would ever have access to in a lifetime. Money, medical care, sports psychologists, if he'd wanted them. A global stage still sitting right there, technically available to him, well into his late 20s. And what he kept doing, documented across 2 countries and multiple outlets, was going home. This is where the easy version of the story stops making sense. Waste only works if you assume the goal was always to stay at the top, and that leaving counts as failure. But nothing in what Adriano actually did supports the idea that he was trying and failing to hang on up there. He kept walking away from it, on his own. Same destination every time. So take the easy word off the table, and you're left with a harder question, the one this video actually cares about. What does it mean when someone has every tool modern football claims to offer? Doctors, therapists, money, a platform seen by millions, and keeps choosing, again and again, to go back to the one place that existed before any of that showed up? Maybe grief just doesn't respond to fame the way the sport assumed it would. Maybe Villa Cruzeiro was never the place Adriano was escaping. Maybe it was the only place that actually held him the whole time. And every club, every contract, every crown the press put on his head was always going to be the temporary thing, not the other way around. That's the real story behind L'Imperatore, not a guy who threw his talent away. A son who lost his father at the exact height of his career and spent the rest of it doing something the entire football world watched happen and mostly got wrong. Trying to find his way back to the one place grief hadn't reached yet. The same streets that made him long before any club, any nickname, or any trophy ever did.